All right, folks, we are back on In the Booth here on Talk Central Phoenix. I am Jim Bunner, your host, America's greatest journalist. All right, so, speaking of breaking the record for the number of House seats lost in one midterm, I just can't help but think that no matter what Joe Biden does, many in the great state of Minnesota are not going to vote against his party next year in the congressional midterms. Yeah, this is the only state that didn't vote for Reagan in 1984, and, well, okay, I'm sure a lot of people out there are probably going to be saying that I'm saying negative things about Minnesota, but no, guess what? I've lived in Minnesota twice. It is a wonderful place. Okay, if you just put politics aside, Minneapolis is a beautiful city. There is plenty to love about St. Paul. You can even head out to Moorhead, where they have the Hemkomst Center, which has really a lot of neat things to look at. So Minnesota is great. But Minnesota is in the news a lot recently because now we all know this is where the big trial of Derek Chauvin is taking place. He was the former Minneapolis police officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck, allegedly killing George Floyd. And now we've got another situation in which another police officer just got in trouble for shooting a guy in the back who was running from cops when she thought that she was pulling out her taser. Okay, well, I'm being joined today by Randy Peterson, who is a senior researcher for the policing initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And Randy is also a former law enforcement officer. We're going to bring him on to talk a little bit about what is going on with law enforcement in some of these situations in Minnesota. Randy, thanks a lot for coming on In the Booth today.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
All right, so talk to me a little bit about your experience. Were you a law enforcement officer in Texas?
No, I was actually a police officer in a suburb just outside of the city of Chicago, about 25 miles west of the city of Chicago, Bloomingdale, Illinois.
Okay.
For 21 years there. I came down to Texas after I retired, and I was the director of the police academy at the Tarrant County College, which is in Fort Worth, for about a year and a half, and then I ended up at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where I am able to research policing as my primary function there.
All right, so, I'm not a police officer. I never have been a police officer. I've never been around it. I don't know what exactly is going on with some of these situations that we're seeing in the news. We're seeing something going on in which some police officer shot an unarmed young black man, and of course we hear all of this about we need police reform in this country, and this is an infringement of racial justice. And I look at some of this. To me, it doesn't look like the police officers in most of these situations, and I'm not a fan of police. I'm not here to say that police officers are all angels and they're perfect. I mean, I've got a disturbing the peace charge on my permanent record from college because I didn't use my Fifth Amendment right to not tell a police officer things I shouldn't have told a police officer. Okay, but it seems to me that in a lot of these cases, cops aren't doing things that are wrong. Am I incorrect about some of this?
No, you're correct. I don't buy into the idea that that policing is a racist institution either. The problem with use of force incidents is that they always look bad, right? Even if they're done well, even if they're completely justified, they still look bad. And that's not a bad thing that they look bad. I mean, that shows that we're still a good society, that the use of force against another person still repulses us. But that doesn't change the fact that use of force is sometimes necessary. And you cannot have authority without the ability to use force. Without the ability to use force, there really is no authority. So we grant police officers the authority to use force to enforce laws that our legislature makes. I mean, and that's what keeps society a civil society.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you talked about that because, that's perfect for what's going on in the news right now. The Derek Chauvin trial, the prosecution, I guess, has wrapped up its arguments, and now the defense is coming out, and They're giving their arguments. I guess that there was an expert talking today about the use of force, and in this case, he is trying to make the argument that Derek Chauvin was justified in using the force that he used. Now, most police officers that I've seen comment on this have seen the video of Derek Chauvin putting his knee on George Floyd's neck while George Floyd was handcuffed to the ground, and I haven't seen a single police officer ever agree that such actions are something that police officers would be trained to do or that they're appropriate for police officers to be doing. Give me a little bit about some of your thoughts on the use of force in the George Floyd situation.
Sure. Well, this is why we're having a trial now, right? And there have been opposing views on this, and there's testimony on both sides of this, and that's why in our criminal justice system we have an adversarial system so that we can have both sides present their argument, and then we hope that the truth will rise to the top there, right? And we will know what happened. So you're right. We've heard use of force experts from the prosecution saying that this was excessive, that this is what killed George Floyd, and then now we're having the defense put on their experts, and they're saying, well, no, this was not excessive, that this is standard procedure for, at least for the Minneapolis Police Department. I think they've introduced, or they're going to introduce, a training manual that shows that exact technique being used in it. So there's we have this conflict between what happened. I guess at the end of the day, when we look at that video, it's really hard to watch, right? Just like you said, even police officers are looking at this saying, wow, this looks horrible, right? So, but we still have to afford Derek Chauvin due process, right? And that's what the trial is for, is to find out exactly what happens. I don't know if you saw last week, but they introduced the different camera angle from the body camera of the police officer behind him, and it doesn't appear that the knee is across the neck the way it appeared on the first video that kind of went viral. I'm not sure where that's gonna go, but if the knee was placed across the shoulder blades the way that it looked there, that would be standard procedure for most police departments, to control a prone suspect with the knee across the shoulder blades, not across the neck like that. We usually train to avoid that, but like I said, there's some controversy as to Minneapolis's training manual that it may actually have had that technique in there, so that's different.
All right. Well, speaking of Minneapolis's training manual, this other police officer who I guess just resigned along with the police chief, she was on the force for 26 years, and she was somebody who was supposed to train the other officers to do their job. Well, apparently she thought that this suspect had been running from her. Well, he had been running from her, but she thought that she was drawing her taser when she drew her gun and shot the guy. And I guess the video that has gone viral shows that she was clearly shocked when she shot him. She thought that she had her taser, but from what I have heard from other law enforcement experts that I've listened to talk about this on other radio shows, it's very hard to mistake a gun for a taser because the gun has different colors on it. The gun is supposed to be on a different side of the officer's hip. And I guess the gun weighs a lot more than the taser, too. So what I'm trying to figure out here is, how did she, after 26 years, and she was supposed to be an expert in all of this, how did she mistake her gun for a taser?
Yes, and all of those things that you said are true. The taser is different from a firearm. It feels different. It weighs different. It points somewhat different. The operating system is similar, but that's in order to make it helpful to the police by limiting how much different kinds of training they would have in using the system. So when we look at the training, the physical skills training is very perishable. If you're not training routinely with both your firearm and your taser and all of your equipment, any of your less lethal items, those skills go away very quickly. So I looking at the video, it absolutely, to me, looks like this was an accident. She yells, taser, 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 which is part of their training. police officers training to let their partners know that they're about to deploy a taser so that they don't get in the way of it. That's why they yell that. And she does that in the video. She does appear completely shocked that she's shot him afterwards. The judgment to use the taser was still good, right? And what we can see in the video, the circumstances that she used it, and the taser was absolutely an appropriate tool for the situation. That would have been an appropriate use of force. But instead, she actually draws her firearm or has her firearm out and shoots him. That's a training issue, right? If you're not getting enough physical skills training, so she made right use of force decision and just applied it horribly wrong, if that makes sense.
Right.
If you're not getting the constant training, and really no police department does get as much training as it should. That's part of the problem with this defund the police movement, is that's what's going to get affected. So we're not going to get more training if we defund the police. We're not going to get better policing or better use of force decisions. We're going to get worse. And we're going to see situations like this be more common under that kind of a agenda.
All right. Well, speaking of defunding the police, or speaking of, police reform, I guess there is a George Floyd police reform bill that is being talked about that you've provided some commentary on. What is this thing?
It's the House, I believe, passed it, and it has various police reforms in there. Kind of like anything that is an emotional reaction to a problem, it really doesn't do anything to fix the actual problem that occurred, right? And we see that with gun control laws and things like that. It's a lot of times they're just more emotional than they are anything else. So we see is things like limiting qualified immunity for police officers, right? Making them more liable for civil rights violations and things like that. It bans chokeholds. Okay, so this is obviously a reaction to the George Floyd incident, but George Floyd was not, Derek Chauvin was not using a chokehold on George Floyd, at least not one that any police department trains in. Most police departments, if they do train in them, and a lot of them don't use chokeholds at all, but the ones that do use what's called a lateral vascular neck restraint, which is not a choke that cuts off the airway. It actually cuts off or limits some of the blood going to the brain, rendering the person unconscious. And it's almost always not lethal. Very, very few people are ever killed with a quote-unquote chokehold by the police. I mean, we have mixed martial arts schools all across the country that train in this every day, and the students choke each other all the time, and they don't kill each other. So that banning it completely even in situations of deadly force, it would be banned. So a police officer could run someone over with a police car or shoot them in that situation, but could not use a less lethal technique like a chokehold. This is not the kind of thinking that we want going into our policy, right? Where we have an emotional response, we don't like the way something looks, and we take away a less lethal technique. I've been in a situation or situations where I was able to apply lateral vascular neck restraint instead of having to shoot the person. So that the suspect is alive today because I had that available to me. If you take those tools out of a police officer's toolbox, you really limit and force them to escalate their use of force.
Okay. Well, it seems like defunding the police would actually harm this situation that we're seeing, where we're having all these conflicts where a police officer, ends up shooting an unarmed black person. Of course, that's the thing that everybody is repeating. This was an unarmed young black person. But if you have less funding, you would have less training. Something else though that has been going through my mind, Randy, is that in all of these situations, somebody was a suspect. Okay, obviously passing a counterfeit bill like George Floyd was doing and having drugs on his possession was not, those were not actions that were deserving of death. And what this other fellow in Minneapolis who was just shot by this female police officer, I guess he had a misdemeanor warrant out and he had expired tags. Obviously, those are not reasons to kill somebody, but for heaven's sake, in both of these situations, the suspect was committing some sort of an infraction of the law, and in both of these situations, the person was resisting arrest. You know, it seems to me that there's more societal reform that we need, more so than police reform. Am I wrong on any of this?
No, you're not wrong at all. The resisting arrest, you're right. None of the crimes in any of these scenarios that we've been talking about tonight, carry the death penalty or are in any way deserving of death. Absolutely in agreement on that. But when you resist arrest, the police officer is not going to just lose interest, right? They're not just going to go away because you resist arrest. They're going to do everything in their power to take you into custody, no matter what the underlying crime was for. That becomes almost irrelevant at that point, right? Once you start resisting arrest, you have escalated the officer's need to use force. And at some point, that goes all the way up to deadly force. If it doesn't matter what the underlying crime was, if the resistance now threatens the officer's life, we end up there. Even if it doesn't threaten the officer's life, anytime we're using force, there's the possibility that bad things could happen. I mean, we're seeing that now. This is what we're talking about tonight. Bad things happening as a result, in part, of a person who decided to resist arrest. Right? There's all the time in the world to address this in court. If you think you're being arrested unlawfully, or if you were targeted because of the color of your skin, you have all of the time in the world in the future to take this to court and address it that way. Fighting with the police on the street, no matter what the reason is never going to end well.
All right. Well, with just the few minutes that we have left, Randy, you had talked to me about the situation with the female cop in Minneapolis. And, I thought that this was just a mistake that she made, and you seem to agree with me. But I've always just been baffled as to how a 26-year veteran could possibly mistake a gun for a taser, and you say that it is a lack of training that she apparently has not had. Okay, that might be a good argument in court. I don't know. I'm not an expert on law enforcement or the legal ramifications. What do you think legally could happen to this officer? Is she going to be charged with something criminal, do you think?
That's a great question. I'm not super familiar with Minnesota's laws as far as reckless homicide or manslaughter, if those would be appropriate or not. I think it's a horrible tragedy, and I'm in agreement with you that this was a horrible mistake on her part. Whether or not it's going to result in a criminal charges or a criminal conviction, that remains to be seen. But to just one step further on what we were talking about with the training, if she got, let's say, 8 hours per year, 1 day per year of training with her taser, that might be standard. Imagine if we asked a baseball player to train for 8 hours of hitting practice, and then we'll see you when the season starts and you can play your game. And there's a lot less at stake in the baseball game than there is with what she was doing. So when we train officers like that, when we only give them this minimal amount of training and we don't constantly expose them to to their equipment and to scenario-based training and have them use it, those skills perish. And it's sad and it's tragic, but it's not completely surprising that this could happen the way that it did.
Well, Randy, something, you and I are not familiar with the laws, the criminal laws in Minnesota, but you know what? I have been fired in Minnesota, and I'm familiar with employee misconduct laws. I will say this much: if she hadn't quit, I think she could have won unemployment from the Minneapolis Police Department. I don't think this would qualify as employee misconduct according to the laws of Minnesota. I will say that much, at least, on the air. All right, well, Randy Peterson with the Texas Public Policy Institute, shedding some light on law enforcement with all of this going on in Minneapolis. Randy, thanks a lot.